Hi friends, welcome to my channel, Sew Obvious. I'm APOLINAR and today I'm going to show you how to do some of the basic stitches that we use in sewing.
It's my first video ever. I'm not nervous.
FYI, this video is one of two. Next week I'm going to continue showing you guys more techniques, so make sure that you subscribe so you can see next week's video. The fabric I'm going to be using today is all from Waverly Inspirationals. It's a fat quarter. It's nothing fancy, it's pretty simple. I got it because it was on sale and I love saving money. Okay guys, let's get started. Alright, the first stitch we're going to learn today is called the straight stitch. It is the most basic stitch in all of sewing, and it is the foundation of the majority of the stitches we're going to learn today and next week. Okay, so for the straight stitch we are going to need 2 pieces of fabric. And we're going to put them right sides together. And we're going to sew it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. For my machine, the 1/2 inch seam allowance is at the edge of the foot. So I'm going to put it underneath. Then you're going to lower your needle. Before we get started on the actual seam, let's talk about back stitching. Back stitching is something you do to lock the seams in place so that they don't unravel on you. Most machines have a button, like this one right here has the button that if you push it, it'll start going backwards. As a rule, I usually do 3 stitches backwards and then go ahead and go forward. And then when I get to the end of the seam, I do another 3 stitches backwards, forward, and done. So let's go ahead and do that. Lift up your sewing foot, lift up the needle. Here we have a straight seam. Now to finish off a straight seam, what you would do is you would go over to your iron, you would press this open, and you would also press the seam allowance open. So that's the straight seam. Stitch number 2 is called the straight stitch. The straight stitch is great for extra strength in the seams. It can also be used as a way to finish off a seam if you don't have pinking shears or a serger. It also prevents fraying of the fabric. Alright, so for the double straight seam, we're going to start with a regular straight seam, and we're actually going to have one more step. So let me put my thread back here. What we're going to do is we are going to line up the original seam with the edge of our sewing foot, and that will make a parallel line that follows it. Don't forget to backstitch. And this is the double straight stitch. Now to finish off this seam, unlike the other seam, the regular straight seam where you would press it open, you would actually press the seam allowance all to one side. And that is the double straight seam. Stitch number 3 is called the top stitch. The top stitch is a great stitch to use for extra strength, and you can even use it for a decorative stitch. It is commonly used in things like button downs and dress shirts. Okay, so for a top stitch, we are again going to start with a straight stitch. This time we are not going to press it open, but we are actually going to press it with the seam allowance to one side. Again, you would press it to whichever side is away from center front. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna line up the seam with the edge of our foot, much like we did for the double straight seam. But we're gonna make sure that the seam allowance is underneath the foot as well. Now this is what a top stitch looks like. As you'll see, you're actually going to see a seam on the outside or the right side of the fabric. So if you use a thread that matches your fabric, you won't really see it. But if you use a different color thread, kind of how I did here with the black on the blue, it could make a really nice decoration. And they actually do make top stitching threads that are much thicker than regular thread. Stitch number 4 is called the double top stitch. The double top stitch is used more commonly with heavier fabrics, something like jeans or even couches and furniture that you would use at home. It's great because it helps prevent a lot of the bulk. Okay, so for the double top stitch, we are again going to start with a straight stitch, but this time we are actually going to press it open like we did for the straight stitch, but then we are going to do an additional 2 seams. So we're going to turn it to the right side and we're going to line up the seam with the edge of our sewing foot. And now what we're going to do is we're going to turn it and we're going to line up the edge of the seam so we can do another line on the other side. And here we have the double top stitch seam. It's great because it kind of does a little finishing on the back, and it makes sure that there's no bulk. It's nice and flat. Stitch number 5 is called the basting stitch. The basting stitch is great for temporary seams. It's also great for gathering, and you can use it to hold pieces of fabric together that might otherwise be too slippery to, I just touched the fly. Pieces of fabric that might be too slippery and hard to work with otherwise. Okay, so for the basting stitch, we are going to treat it kind of like a straight stitch. We are going to do 2 pieces of fabric right sides together, but before we sew, we have to make sure that we have our stitch length as long as possible. So I have one of the LED machines, so mine just lets me push a couple buttons, and I just moved my stitch length from 2.5, which is the regular stitch length, to 5. Some of you guys might have a machine that has a wheel that you can turn. Just figure out which the stitch length is and make it as wide as possible. So here's the basting stitch. Let me find my straight stitch. Here it is. Here's a double straight stitch. But if you look at the lengths of each stitch, you can see that this is almost twice as big as these ones. Stitch number 6 and today's last stitch is called the zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch is great for gathering fabric. It's more commonly used on stretch fabric, and some people use it as a decorative stitch. Okay, for the zigzag stitch, we are again going to be pushing some buttons over here. Now I'm going to move my stitch length back to 2.5. As you can see, I have all these different stitches that my machine can do. The zigzag stitch that I'm going to use is number 4. So we're going to click this till it's number 4. The machine knows what widths and what stitch length it's going to do. Your machine might be different. Again, if you have one of those ones that turns, it lets you choose whatever you want as far as how far back and forth the zigzags go. So here, we're gonna put it at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Don't forget to back stitch. And here we have the zigzag stitch. The zigzag stitch, if this were a stretchy fabric, when I pulled on it, the zigzags would actually become more like a straight line. And then when you let go, they go back to being the zigzags. All right, friends, so that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, leave a like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, all that stuff. I'm sure you've heard this spiel a million times before, so you know what to do. Okay, bye.